the Wood at Davos house, the virtual wood house that many of you out there have been to in the real world when we did COP26 in November. But based on the situation we are in right now with COVID, we are running the virtual wood house, even though the guests we have with us today have been to the real thing. We were united at COP26, so it's great to see you again. In this session here, we will be focusing on energy. Today at the World Economic Forum is the big energy day. As you know, wood is part of the World To-Do list where we are supporting clean energy. And we are very delighted to be speaking about navigating the energy transition with literally just to pay for 1 hour ago at the World Economic Forum. If you did not have the opportunity to watch the session, you should go and see it. There was incredible highlight conversations, and I'll just speak a little bit about it before we go in to the detail of this session. So the session at the World Economic Forum today was really about how we can navigate the energy transition. We know when we went to COP that there's a lot of pledges, there's a lot of technology solutions. We talk about the digitalization of the entire energy sector. There's a lot of commitments. We know that there's a lot of investment going into this, and we are even saying that the biggest investment in technology right now is in the energy sector. This was also in the conversation that was at the World Economic Forum, which was facilitated by Daniel Yergin. He's the vice chairman of IHS Markets. He first spoke to the Minister of Energy from Saudi Arabia, who spoke about the whole movement of blue, green, and pink hydrogen, and about some of the great initiatives that is happening in Saudi. And I know Dan, who is with me here, has a lot of experience working in Saudi Arabia with Saudi Aramco, where I also had the pleasure actually to be a couple of times. But that was a great kickoff of the session today, and that was then followed up by Bjørn Rosengren who's the President and Chief Executive Officer from ABNB, who spoke about great technologies, what we do need to be able to do this transition. In that session, we also had Vicky Huller, President and Chief Executive Officer of Occidental Petroleum Corporation, and many, many more great people. So don't miss out that session. You can go to the World Economic Forums and watch it later today. But again, this session here, I have the pleasure to hand over to Dan, who's going to be the moderator, but is also the person who leads our global decarbonisation initiative at Woods. He's going to speak about the role of technology in the decarbonisation of the industry. With us, we have Tom White from Sea Capture. He's the CEO of Sea Capture, and Jonathan Briggs, from Director for Humble Zero. And I had the pleasure to meet you in person in the real wood house. And I just want to tell you, it do exist. It was not taken down. It is the people who work at Wood in Glasgow. They live their life in that great office, and it's actually going to be our new way of having offices around the world. So even though it's a virtual one, you know how the real one feels. Okay, over to you, Dan. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ant. So I think, as Ant's already mentioned, decarbonising, reducing carbon emissions from existing industry and infrastructure is absolutely key if we're going to achieve the net zero goals that have been put in place by many geographies and organisations. COP26 last year, there was a recommitment to come back with more ambitious climate change or decarbonisation targets across the globe by the end of 2022. What we're seeing at the moment is many corporations are setting their own net zero goals in advance of policy and legislation as part of their own ESG objectives. But do the technologies we need to meet net zero exist today? And if not, what do we need to do to develop and evolve technology to meet our decarbonised future? So what I'd like to do first is to ask our panellists to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail and perhaps share what they think is the #1 issue we need to resolve to realise net zero in an industrial context. So Jonathan, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. So Jonathan Briggs, I manage the Humber Zero project at Immingham, and the goal, the long-term objective there is essentially to decarbonise the Immingham site, and that's a very industrial site, home to over 25% of the UK's refining capacity, and at the VPI combined heat and power plant, you've got over 1,200 megawatts of steam and power generation on site. The first phase is really to start deployment of post-combustion capture at scale. So that's just kind of the scale of the project and what we're trying to do there, all of which is really in support of decarbonising industry, one of the biggest industry clusters, in fact, sorry, the biggest industry cluster in the UK, the Humber, and ultimately in support of getting to net zero by 2050, as we all really are working towards that goal. What really needs to, above anything, I think, to drive some of these, just projects to delivery and to delivering at scale, I think, probably two things. I think there's a lot of things, ultimately in project delivery to complete, but fundamentally, I think, the government policy, I think, is an easy one to identify, and developing the business models that the government is currently doing. But I think equally important is delivering the stores that will be available to projects of that size, to actually enable them to get to scale and find homes for, essentially a large amount of CO2.
Just to follow up, right, Jonathan, I think, part of that challenge is cross-business collaboration. So in terms of the storage aspect, where do you see the main responsibility for developing those stores lying at the moment?
So I think there, one of the great advantages and the reasons why TCS is being progressed so far in advance of other geographies, and is the fact that the UK has great strategic assets in storage available to it. All of it, the offshore industry presents a lot of those stores to projects such as Humber Zero. The responsibility, I guess, of just those that really will participate in that space are those that have basically been active in working around those stores for decades. So it's the oil companies working with the regulators, Oil and Gas Authority, to define standards of storage and actually develop what's going to have to be a new framework to enable molecules to go back into those stores, if you like. So all of that know-how, the expertise, absolutely there. Having come from an oil company previously in my career, great set of expertise is there to be redeployed, if you like, to develop those stores for projects.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Perhaps we'll come back to that comment around redeployment of skills a little bit later. Tom, if we can come to you next, say a bit more about yourself and what you think is the number one issue we need to resolve to realise net zero.
Thank you, Dan. So yes, my name is Tom White. I'm the CEO of SeaCapture. SeaCapture is a startup technology development company based in Leeds, in the north of England. And we have a new chemical technology, the first new chemical technology in 50 years in carbon capture and storage, which uses an entirely new chemical pathway to capturing carbon dioxide, and it does not use amines in any way. So we are developing that. At the moment, we're at the prototyping phase, and with our shareholders, we've had 2 prototypes go into Drax, and we've got a 3rd prototype going in this year, which we will use to gather data to scale up to our commercial deployment design. And we'll be looking for customers, like Jonathan, who using engineering partners like yourselves, Dan, to engineer and scale up our chemical technology for deployment in physical assets. So that's me and what SeaCapture's doing. But in terms of the number one issue, it's really about joining up the entire supply chain, from carbon capture transmission and sequestration into one visible and transparent market mechanism. Because what we're hearing is there's a wall of money out there wanting to invest in energy transition. What we don't have is defined projects which are bankable. And a key part of the bankability, number one, is the cost of the project, but also the price point that is going to make an investment possible. So there's that natural tension around what is it cost to do carbon capture and storage, and there's been plenty of naysayers over the last 20 years. So I've been working in CCS for 20 years. Along with a 10-year break in the Middle East. So, and your point around Saudi Aramco is very pertinent. I've spent quite a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. They're a big organization, Saudi Aramco. So we've got to bring the cost down. The people who are going to develop the large projects have got to be large organizations who've got that ability to design and roll out and manage large-scale infrastructure projects. And the best candidates for that right now are the oil companies themselves, because they're also part of that supply chain. So it's all about joining up that supply chain and transparency of that commercial mechanism, so that banks and investors can come along and say, oh yes, that works, we can do that, or let's evaluate. So transparent, the full value chain.
Yes, I think also transparency, and back to that comment that Jonathan made a little bit about those transitional skills benefiting that value chain from capture all the way through to storage.
Right.
I think one of my biggest takeaways from COP26 was actually so many financial institutions, financiers, they have capital available. What they don't know is where to invest it, and to have those clear investment metrics that they can rely on to understand they're going to get a return. Do you think we actually need to think about the way in which we measure, or return on capital employed, return on investment, maybe looking at some different metrics for the future to enable technologies that are going to underpin the energy transition?
Well, I do think that right now, well, the only way of truly measuring the financial returns of a project is by using financial metrics at the moment. I do think that the UN Sustainable Goals gives us other metrics that we can use to measure the benefit of a particular project. So is what we've got perfect? No, not at all. Does it need development and work? Yes, absolutely. But I think for any project to proceed, there's got to be three real solutions. There's the technical solution, the commercial solution, and the socio-political solution. So I'm an engineer, so as far as I'm concerned, there's always going to be a technical solution. We can put people on the moon, we can get there. But is there a commercial solution? And that's the price point and the cost point. Can we get that balance right? There's always going to be pressures on costs, so we need new technologies. And then the socio-political solution: do we have a mandate? Are we allowed to do something in a certain way? And bringing carbon capture units into built-up areas is not a thing that we're having to do just yet, but it's coming, because that's where the waste-to-energy plants are. That's where other single source emission points are. So we're going to have to come up with solutions which are socially and politically acceptable.
Thanks, Tommy. I think sometimes we constrain ourselves in the financial perspective for looking for that return on investment on project number one, which might be a first of a kind technology deployed at a new scale, rather than maybe looking at the potential deployment of that technology and how the financial return would evolve over time. That's really good, thank you. And Anne, if we could come to you next, what do you think is the number one challenge we need to address to realise net zero?
So I'm going to take the opportunity to reflect a little bit to the next session we have today, which is actually about what if we could, what if carbon could become an asset? What if we could commercialize carbon? What if carbon become the desirable thing that we really want to use for something? And because it's all about incentive, right? Now we talk about capturing it, but what if we will capture it, and what if we will then commercialize it and use it for something that has a high value? And will that be the incentive for us to really get this transition going much faster? So I actually want to, sorry for that, because that's the conversation we'll have later today, put that back to all of you and think about that perspective. What if we could do that? Because I agree with Tom about, you know, with the technology we have at hand today, we can more or less do anything we want, but is it political okay, regulations okay, is investing there, is it, you know, the whole thing about the go-to-market in this. So I would like to know how you look at it. What if carbon had a high value? What if it was desirable when we capture it? Yeah, so sorry for that. I put a question back in.
I think it's fantastic, Anne, because we've talked a lot, COP, previously, throughout previous years, about the carbon tax, so the stick approach. And it's proving to be very, very difficult to agree some global fundamentals that can underpin the calculation of a carbon tax. So absolutely, looking at how we can value that carbon in other ways and what we could use it for is an alternative solution and one which may bear fruit sooner. I don't know, Jonathan, Tom, have you got any views on carbon use?
I mean, well, sorry, Tom. I mean, it used to be, well, not used to be, it still currently is CCUS, so utilization is definitely part of the definition, if you like. And to Anne's point, it would definitely transform the whole industry if we found a way of actually utilizing carbon. I mean, obviously, the one sticker is we're talking about, in some cases, for the most part, we're talking about CO2 and not necessarily carbon. There's definitely a use for carbon in many applications. There's a chemical process you've got to get through and figure your way through to get to that point. But there's no question. I mean, currently we're putting together an industry that's trying to manage large volumes of CO2, and it's only coming through as a cost, you know, and a considerable cost. And from an engineering point of view, to Tom's comment earlier, we can manage that, but it's all been, you know, treated as a cost. If we found a way of actually providing value, and in the past there have been applications of CO2, but they're all quite small scale applications. That's the big issue, you know, the big conundrum is to use CO2. We've got so much of it that we've got to find a really big use for it. So I'm not quite sure we've actually identified that use just yet.
Yeah, Jonathan, really good point. Let me build on that. So, I mean, there is a market right now for CO2. So, medical grade CO2 sells for north of £800 a tonne. £800 a tonne, fantastic. You could float most carbon capture projects with £800 a tonne, but they are measured in the hundreds of tonnes in utilisation. When we start capturing carbon dioxide on the millions of tonnes basis, very quickly that market, the existing market, will collapse. Therefore, what is the utilisation of very, very large volumes of CO2? So when people talk about, it's so hard to imagine. So the amount of CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere globally has the same mass as the amount of concrete we pour globally. And they're equivalent figures. That's an astonishing mass of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere. So we're talking inhuman and unimaginable scales. So if we are talking about utilization of carbon on that scale, it's got to be in fields where we are using mineralized CO2 capture into things that are going to be made into buildings. So things have crossed my desk recently. There's some very high CO2 content concretes. So sort of north of 50%. Most technologies around 5% of a concrete can be CO2 utilization, but that, it's not enough. The utilization of CO2 to make carbon fiber, now that could replace steel girders in construction. The energetics of that have not been worked out yet. So there are ideas on the horizon. There's a technical solution, but we don't yet have a commercial solution and a socio-political solution for those yet. So the technical solutions are out there. We need, in order to scale those up, then we need the commercial and the political solution.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think
Fundamentally, though, just to add to that, I think the big picture perspective is that we're still taking a large amount of carbon from out under the ground and using it and putting it into the atmosphere. So whatever we do, I mean, Tom's right. We've got to figure out ways of being smarter about deriving value. But we've got a process where CCS is largely about trying to find ways of addressing the balance of taking fossil fuels from that would have otherwise been contained, quite happily for another several million years below ground, and what that means is essentially putting them back underground. So it's the sequestration part of it is always going to be, a large part of the story, if not, the vast majority of the story, I think.
I think that the concrete example is a good one as well, Tom, because that is a value-added alternative to sequester CO2 rather than convert it. And I think sometimes we talk about that conversion question, as CO2 as a combustion product, lowest energy state, converting it to something else is going to require us to consume more energy. And more energy may then mean further emissions that we then need to abate. So we get into this circular argument.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Dan, because when we talk about CO2, we're often talking about energy generation. And really what this panel's about is that hard to decarbonise sector. So everything that can be decarbonised should be decarbonised. So renewable power is, the most obvious part of that equation. But there are certain products which generate CO2 in their manufacturing process. And you can't make glass or steel or concrete currently without generating CO2. So if we assume away that all power is going to be renewable, we're still left with an industrial sector that needs to be decarbonised. So how are we going to do that? And what are we going to do with that CO2? Jonathan's point is absolutely right. The only large-scale option we have on the table right now is sequestration. So the networks of transmission and storage are key to getting that decarbonisation achieved. In order to decarbonise the really hard to abate sectors like waste to energy, cement, steel, glass, these are often in built up areas. So we need to find new ways of capturing CO2 in a way that's acceptable. So, and this is one of our key drivers at Sea Capture. Our technology is environmentally benign. So the current techniques of capturing carbon dioxide use a very toxic compound, which will always have a very small emission point to atmosphere, even with the best scrubbers, which is politically and socially unacceptable. So we can't put carbon capture plants, and shouldn't, in schools and built up areas. So if we can't do that, what are we going to use? So there's new technologies there which are going to unlock one of those three solutions. And the mandate for an environmentally benign carbon capture system is very strong. We need to do that. So that's one of our strong pushes, our strong developmental areas. And then driving the cost down, we can't expect the cash, it's very easy for us to complain and say the government should pay for this. Well, they should, but that's us, we're the taxpayer. So we need to make sure that the solutions are affordable. So one of our objectives is to demonstrate our technical claim that we use 40% less energy to capture CO2 than the existing available techniques. And that's a game changer. That reduces the cost of carbon capture to a tipping point that we believe will then be adopted globally. And that's really, really important. And the third point really is this, the hard to abate sectors typically are a lot more aggressive in their flue gases. So for example, the glass industry's got very high sulfur oxides and nitrous oxides in their flue gases. And most existing techniques cannot deal with that level of contamination. So we're developing a solution that will be able to address that. So if we assume away all of the fossil fuel power generation and we're left with that hard to sector, what technologies, commercial solutions and political mandates will allow us to really decarbonize those areas too? And that's really, and if we get all of those proof points, then we're up for that global deployment that we're all looking for. And utilization, great. If we can utilize the captured CO2 in those hard to abate sectors, and we don't need storage, and we can create a product in that space, then that's only going to accelerate the adoption of CCS.
So you talked a bit about the development of technology, the deployment. I think, Tom, do you think there's further work to do as well in terms of those industrial sectors, the client base in those sectors, helping them understand how the integration works with their existing processes, their existing technology, to be able to move forward towards a decarbonised pathway?
I think the people who are in a position to invest in this kind of infrastructure are very well informed. I think there's a long way to go in the investment because they're technical people. They're operating a process plant. They understand process constraints. I mean, of course, there's a spectrum of how of the level of understanding of different technologies. I think that the wider community needs to comprehend the complexity of what we're doing. It's a chemical plant that we stick on the end of a glass, cement, steel. It's an entirely new unit. Often has got the same value as the existing unit itself. It's not a 5% capex bolt-on. You know, in some cases, it's 100% capex bolt-on, and any new infrastructure should be built in an integrated way and designed to be more efficient. So yes, there's an element of education, but in the operators of those emission points, they're pretty well educated. It's normally the financial institutions backing them that need to understand the complexity and the requirement for validation owners, engineers to go in and really test and measure the veracity of the solutions being that are being thrown, that are being discussed. So, and Jonathan, as an operator of a large emission point, I mean, I'm sure that you're going through a series of complex exercises selecting technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as you say, Tom, not every process fits well with a certain technology. There's advantages to certain processes that sort of lead you towards certain technology providers. I think for one of the main considerations for some of the early projects or the deployment projects, of which we're hoping to be one, is making sure that whatever you do decide in the first instance really can work at scale. So the initial projects won't necessarily have the future technology providers associated with them. They might do, but the real the importance for the early project is actually making sure that you don't. There's so many other risks that you don't have an additional risk to manage in just the technology working at the level you want it to.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think it's an important factor there as well, isn't it? We are learning across the industry. I think we're learning which technologies fit with which particular industrial sectors and how we can move forward. So yeah, what do you see really as the key benefits or learnings from Humber Zero that can help inform future projects in the UK and globally when it comes to decarbonisation?
Well, I mean, there's one single piece of learning, which is you can put these projects together and you can bring investors and they generate a return. I mean, that in and of itself means that you've managed to get all of the pieces of the chain working together to deliver something that you can actually demonstrate works economically. But beyond that, I think there's obviously, you know, a number of different learnings on, you know, for example, technology selection, what works for a particular process, and can you optimize it over time? How do you, in our case, we're retrofitting an existing plant, very, you know, very efficient, large scale, very important piece of the generation portfolio for the UK. And you know, when the wind is blowing, and it's great, but when, you know, there's flexibility in the system that you need to retain. So operability with retrofit is really important. So some of these types of learning is on how to actually operate the same set of assets in this different world with the retrofit. Permitting, how to manage different solvents that are going to be used on sites that really haven't had that experience of using them. I mean, I can go on. There's a number of different levels, but I think fundamentally, you know, we talked about the wall of investment that's ready to make, you know, money available to these types of projects, making sure that we can deliver these projects at the scale that they're needed, and it really is needed at a significant scale, that we can demonstrate economic viability.
Scale, pace, in terms of we need to start deploying projects at pace to achieve those learnings, to achieve technology development, to bring the cost down. And actually, just touching on that point of permitting, you know, I've talked to many clients around the world, and actually the permitting process can be the rate determining step in terms of the overall delivery of the project in some parts of the world. So there's probably work to do there from a policy perspective as well to enable us to move faster.
I agree.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've talked a bit about, you know, the hard to abate industries, the technologies, how moving them forward. But also, how do we make sure that people are going to deliver on the targets that they've set? So I think, you know, maybe Anne, you could kick this one off, but monitoring those decarbonisation targets, whether it's at a countrywide level, regional, corporate or asset, is going to be a challenge that we need to put in place. So how do you think we can leverage some of our existing technology to support that monitoring of decarbonisation targets against the wider ESG goals?
So what I think is super interesting, what's going on right now, and you all kind of touched on it, is that whatever we're going to build now, the technologies here need to be scalable, affordable, and accessible, because it's not enough that we just decarbonize part of the world or part of the wealthy countries. We need to make sure we build a solution that everybody can be part of. So that's one thing I want to, and that's what I love here when they speak at the World Economic Forum, that it is a cross conversation across the world, that we also saw COP26. I also think it's important that, and I always say that 2021 was the year that we begin to understand what does it mean to become net zero. So we did the big pledges. Most companies had pledged before they came to COP, and COP was more about the solution. But 2021 was also the year where we begin to do reporting. We begin to collect the data. I was part of, as Dan knows, creating the SDG ambition, which is the UN, the most used private framework, where one of the measurements is emission 1, 2, and 3 with the SDG ambition. But doing measurements is really hard. It's really difficult. And you need to have certain measurement tools in place. And we would have been rolling this out in a big way together with our SCORE framework here in 2021. But one thing is to measure, and to what we talk about this panel here is about how do we then provide a solution afterwards that we can actually change the status quo, that we can actually reach to net zero by 2050 or whatever year you put in front of you. And this is where I think things are super fascinating, because when you hear all this commitment coming from the private sector, coming from head of states, I don't think any of us know how 2050 look like. I don't think anybody understands what it means to be in 2050 and what kind of technology is at hand. I was fortunate to live in Silicon Valley when the whole expensive technology really started for 10 years ago, and to see where we were for 10 years ago in technology and where we are today is a whole other world, right? So how will 2050 look like? And that's the reason why I applaud, and both Jonathan and Tom, you spoke about it, that we have never seen so much money being brought into digitalization of the energy sector as we see now. There's a lot of risk taking, there's a lot of unknown, and what is needed to build those solutions. So to your point, then, I think 2022 cannot be just about measurement anymore. This is what we started doing in 2021. 2022 needs to be the year where we drive the transformation and begin to reach the net zero by 2050, even though it's the unknown thing that we go into. And I do need to say it here, I don't even think Dan knows this about me, but I'm actually a science fiction writer, and I use science fiction to predict the future. And I think it's like scenario planning, right? So I think my advice to companies who did the pledge, who did the 2050 target, is that you need to use scenario planning and science fiction thinking and go backwards and say, if I want to become net zero by 2050, what would that take? And then begin to really set up the right innovation teams within the company, work a lot with the startup community, and begin to build solutions. So it was a bigger reply then, but now you let me give you some input on it.
Yeah, well, ultimately it all comes back to one of the biggest challenges we've got now in managing carbon emissions in some industries, in some locations, is still actually managing those and measuring them in the first place. That old scientific adage that you can't manage what you cannot measure. So I think we see tools, systems, digital technology as being core to both that management effort, but also helping to inform the abatement solution. So we talked a lot, Jonathan and Tom, we talked a lot about technology development from a process technology perspective, but there's also something there from the point of view of those tools that we use to measure our carbon emissions on a real-time basis, enable us to take instantaneous action if we see things going outside their normal parameters. Even starting just with energy efficiency. We talked, Tom, about minimizing the fossil fuels that we consume. So energy efficiency is the first step on that journey. So I think there's plenty of work to do. I'll ask Jonathan and Tom if they've got any comments on that subject, but also to our audience, if you want to put any questions for the panel in the chat, we've got sort of 7 or 8 minutes left and we can look to address those as well.
I just want to pick up what you just said, what I didn't mention before. So when I built the SDG ambition with UN, we took 3 years to build the SDG ambition, which is a translation of the 17 global goals into 10 ambitions. Because remember, the 17 global goals was actually built for governments and countries, not for the private sector. The 10 ambition is the most used framework today in the private sector. When we built that framework, we did a mapping up against the technology stacks, and there is a 75% technology gap if we look at the whole area around the whole net zero climate area. It was also confirmed by Bill Gates, and he's, by the way, speaking later today at the World Economic Forum together with John Kerry, who also confirmed there was this is 1 year ago now, 75% technology gap in the area of digitalizing the energy sector, which is also the reason why that is the biggest area right now for investment in technology and the biggest area for innovation right now. So I just want to let the audience know this. So if you are interested, please join forces in building great energy solutions going forward. If you're an investor, I mean, whatever kind of role you have in this, as engineers, investor, or as a technology person, a lot needs to be built. And I think we need to be humble about this. And that was also what was discussed both yesterday and the day before the World Economic Forum, is that we have technology, but we need to build the solutions. Like, you have the capabilities, but you need to build the technology solutions, right? And then as Jonathan talks about, we also need now to start to run some projects and learn from those projects and get things going. And it is hard. I think we also need to understand this is not difficult. This is difficult. It's very difficult. Yeah. So maybe what we should do then, maybe we should do a last round of comments, and then we should look at the session that's coming after this one. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think just before bringing in Jonathan and Tom, just reflect on that and that conversation around building the models. It also comes back to that transitional skills piece again. How do we use the skills that we've got today adapted to that future scenario that you were talking about, Anne? What do we need 50 years from now? How do we build towards that? What are the building blocks we've got in place today that can help us to achieve it? And we do have a lot of skill sets, a lot of technology that can help us enable the net zero future. It's how we deploy it. I think Jonathan, Tom.
I'll jump in. So look, I love the idea of using science fiction as a mechanism to drive development targets. Your TED talk, Anne, around using what do you call it, Star Trek as a way of generating new ideas. Seriously, joking aside, starting with in mind, we do have to know what our projects want to achieve, and there's lots of boring reasons for projects to go wrong, let alone using new technology. So while we do talk about, there's a wall of money out there, there's not a wall of money of risk-taking money for first-of-a-kind projects. So as a technology developer, what we find as a limiting constraint is, we've got a great idea, we've got the technology. Do we have a commercial solution for our first commercial scale demonstration plant? No, we don't, not yet. We've got a social political driver. Absolutely, we need to have that new technology to fill part of that 75% technology gap. So there's money, but there's not the right type of money. If somebody says they've got a $1 billion investment fund for green tech, well, what proportion of that is in helping new projects develop and mature so they can shift the rest of their 1 billion? I don't see that. So if I was going to say, what's the one thing that we can do to address the number one challenges of the transparency of that whole value chain, it's get some risk money out there.
If I could just add to this, if I look at the whole investor market right now, you have never seen family office are really stepping up, right? There are so many foundations, there are so many who go in, and they are more risk that you normally have seen in the past. So it is shifting, but it is also massive what it takes, right, to move this. Jonathan?
I think I would just perhaps add, so I agree wholeheartedly that in order to, to really change and to go, to transform, if you like, you really have to jump in feet first. You have to feet first, rather, and you have to, to really move forward with intent. So ambition is key. And then I think the other thing is, which is really actually, is largely happening, but it is basically the need to collaborate. This is one of the few industries, if you like, where actually the scale of the challenge is so huge that some of the normal ways in which companies work in terms of competitive positioning, competitive practices, don't necessarily lend themselves to, transferring learnings, opening up in terms of sharing what you're doing, learning from other people's mistakes. So somehow, there's a natural need in certain, cases to compete, because there aren't infinite resources here, and we've got to put our best foot forward. But there's a real tension between the need to compete and to basically put your best projects out there to make sure that you really demonstrate success, but then also to make sure that we actually don't, crush the ability to collaborate.
Agree wholeheartedly. Thank you, Jonathan. That framework, realize the learnings from each other, but allow competition in the future, is a very difficult balance to strike, and something that probably needs a lot more further thought. I'd like to thank you all for participating this afternoon, and perhaps Anne, you could tell us about the next exciting session on the program.
Yeah, I would love to. You probably kind of already know it based on what I said. The next session that we have today is the future of carbon. And it is really around, you don't need to work in the energy sector to understand the scale of the climate change challenge, but to achieve the energy transition while maintaining energy security, multi-connected pathways that include conventional energy will be required. Learn how we can deliver conventional energy sources as clearly, effectively, and securely as possible, and how we can capitalize on carbon as a resource. So this conversation is really about what if carbon was a resource? What if we could capitalize on it? So it's a nice segue from the session that we just have. And after that, we also have another lounge that we are part of that we also had in the COP26, which is the FQ lounge. So we have a session around the women leaders solving the ocean challenges. And then we are going back in and listening at the World Economic Forum, where Bill Gates is speaking, John Kerry is speaking, accelerating scaling up climate innovation. And after that, we then continue with women leading the energy transition in the FQ lounge, and then we are back in the Wood House, where we speak about accelerating and scaling up climate innovation in mining, energy, and transportation. So there's a lot today. So we kicked off today with this incredible session, and I want to thank Dan, Jonathan, Tom, and thank you for coming back to the virtual Wood House. Remember, the Wood House is also a physical place, so hopefully next time we'll be in person in the house itself. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for listening in. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.